Thanks very much, Dave. Since you've embarrassed me, I'll embarrass you. I wrote a lot of my PhD at, not actually under Dave's supervision, but living in New Zealand, struggling with a postdoc, and I would send Dave chapters at any time of the day in New Zealand, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning in Arizona or 5 o'clock in the morning, and I would always get detailed, helpful comments back within 10 minutes. So I have an empirical proof that Dave never sleeps, or at least it didn't sleep at that point. So I'm very grateful.
Before he even got
So Anna was reminding us yesterday that we're talking about infants, but infants should really be part of the conversation. And I completely agree. So I asked my partner if I could bring our kids, and she wasn't so keen on subjecting them to a 24-hour flight, just so I could show them to you. So here's some photos. Instead, this is where the male and the female juveniles of the species. And we're told in the textbooks that the best way of studying, sometimes we're told the only way of studying consciousness is verbal report, introspective verbal report. So I asked Otto, he was 4.5 at the time, what are you aware of? And he said, everything. I asked Orla, she was Orla 1.5 at the time, and she ignored me. Maybe because she was pre-verbal, or maybe she just thought it was a really dumb question, which it probably is. I love this photo. Kind of reminds us that the consciousness, the etymology is knowing together. And there's a subjectivity, a second person element that, again, Anna was talking about implicit in this photo. So, we know that infants are, the term itself, infant without language, pre-verbal. But we also know that the connection between language and consciousness is pretty tenuous. And I think the rise of LLMs has reinforced that. So here's one paragraph of a 47,000-word conversation. It's all on the web if you want to read it. It's pretty interesting, between Murray Shanahan, computer scientist and philosopher, with Claude about consciousness. And it goes on and on and on in this vaguely sensible, vaguely kind of Claude-esque way about Buddhism and free will and subjectivity. It's talking about consciousness, but not many people think that Claude would be actually conscious. Certainly Murray doesn't. Okay, so 1.5-year-olds all are in this photo. I think most of us think are conscious. What about if we go a little bit earlier? So this is 4.5 months. I was able to take this photo. This was taken at LAX, so the baby hanging station. I was able to take this because 4.5-month-olds don't do much and they don't roll. So I was able to take a camera. Even with 86 billion neurons, they're not wired up for motor control much at 4.5 months. Didn't have to worry about him falling off the change mat. And we know from Giselle's work that Sid talked about yesterday, where a lot of people were talking about, that there's all sorts of amazingly complex perceptual processing going on by 4.5 months. But the behavioral immaturity of the Homo sapien is quite surprising, especially when you contrast it with what you can get from a bee with 1 million neurons. So here's, I'm not going to go through this. I don't know how much of that you can read, but here's a list of, 59 fairly distinct behaviors that worker honeybees perform with a brain that's much, much smaller than the fetal brain, even at, 20 weeks. So we've got bees, we've got babies. Let's look at what people think about the attribution of consciousness as just a place to start the conversation. So here's some survey data from 2 ASSC conferences, mostly scientists, some philosophers. Most folks think that they themselves are conscious, which is kind of good, that other people are conscious. I mean, there's always going to be some people who say, monkeys, dogs, octopuses, and babies. I mean, it's not super well-structured survey because we don't know exactly what they mean by a baby, but babies come somewhere between octopuses and bats in terms of people's willingness to attribute consciousness to them. We don't have bees on this list, but my guess is bees would come in somewhere around about fish. They're often discussed as sort of problematic cases where you've got complex behavior, but very different neuroanatomy. They're very different evolutionary paths. Worms, yeah, get a little bit of love, but it's down below 25%. Surprisingly, more people think rocks are conscious than trees. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I'm certain about that, so maybe that's just someone having a laugh. I don't know. So that's the SSC data. Here's data from the Phil paper survey that David Bourget and Dave Chalmers put together. A little bit more helpful because we now know that it's not just babies, it's newborn babies. Comes at about 85%. Again, above fish, which is, I guess, the closest proxy for what I think people would have said about bees. But usefully, they've also included AI systems, not just current AI systems, but future AI systems. And I guess it's current AI systems that I'm interested in contrasting things with today and really miserable 3.5%. So maybe philosophers are a little bit more willing to ascribe consciousness to babies than scientists, but interestingly more willing to ascribe consciousness to neonates than they are to fish and flies, I suspect to bees and to current AI systems. Okay, so speaking of neonates, what do we want to say about neonates? There's a lot of discussion yesterday. This is Otto, my son. I think this was taken about an hour, not more than 2 hours after he was born. He's asleep, which is a bit unusual, I understand. Most babies look a bit more like this. Pediatricians in the room will correct me. There's many things that they might want to correct me about, so please don't hesitate. I'm a philosopher. This is taken from a Lagerkrantz and Slotkin, very fascinating piece from '66, The Stress of Being Born. But they're alert for the first 2 hours or so after birth. And when you think about it, why wouldn't you be alert? Here's what's just happened. You've gone from a prenatal state, which is very warm, 37 degrees in Celsius, 98.6 Fahrenheit, a highly predictable environment, hasn't changed a whole lot while you've been maturing. Your metabolic needs have been taken care of. You haven't had to do anything. Oxygen is supplied, energy is supplied. You don't need to worry about thermoregulation. For the Kiwis in the audience, whanau is a Maori word, which I recently discovered. It's usually used in the context of land or people, so tangata whenua. The whenua are the tangata whenua are the people of the land, so whenua is the land. But it's also a word for placenta, which I think is a wonderful thing. It's that your placenta is your land in Māori. It supports you in that way. I think that's a very insightful lexical move. And there are all these suppressing neuromodulators, which, as it were, sedate the fetus in various degrees. Postnatal state is very different in many dimensions. It's going to be colder, even in a warm delivery room, it's probably going to be colder. Your environment has much more unpredictability, and it's not just different from the prenatal environment, but there's unpredictability within it. And this came up yesterday. There was a fascinating discussion between Topin and Gislan about this, but in some sense, the fetus/baby has gone from being gone to a situation where they're now an ectoderm, right? They've got to take care of their own metabolic process, their own thermoregulation. Now the mother's going to help them, the caregiver is going to help them, but they now can sweat when they get too hot. They develop the capacity to shiver after a while. They have to participate, of course, with the mother, but participate in taking in their own energy, which they didn't have to do previously, right? They have to latch on. They have to look for the breast when they're hungry. And so the responsibility is obviously not just to the baby. It's shared with the mother and other caregivers for those basic homeostatic metabolic processes, but it's in part the baby's responsibility in the way that it wasn't previously. And there are high levels of stress hormones. So no wonder the process of birth wakes you up and you go to this high alert state. Does birth switch consciousness on? I think that's not a crazy thought. I'm not the first person who suggested, obviously. It's an idea that's been floated, but I think it's a really interesting one. But there's also room for skepticism and debate. So perhaps neonates, full term neonates, are akin to vegetative state, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome patients. They're awake, but not aware, not consciously aware. That's one possibility. And perhaps the selective responses, which you do see in neonates across a range of domains, a range of stimuli, are akin in some ways to those blind sight patients. Right? So there's a representation of features of the world, but it's not conscious. That's the skeptical position. Okay. What about before birth? So here's the 19-week scan of Otto giving us a high five. And, you know, you can look at this in sort of two ways. But most people, I think, would say there's very little evidence for consciousness at this age. And it's not just the kind of data that William Graff was beautifully giving us yesterday, that I think it was 20 weeks you were saying the brain's the size of a strawberry. There is that, but you know, a strawberry is a whole lot bigger than the brain of a bee. It's what I think convinces most people that there's really no reasonable prospect of consciousness at this age is the lack of connections between the thalamus and the cortex. All right, the neurons or the precursors of the neurons, the neuroblasts, don't really migrate from the subplate up to the cortex till about 24, 25, 26 weeks. And it's that which leads most people, we'll see some exceptions in 10 minutes, to think that even that there's no real capacity for consciousness until 24 weeks in a minimum. So another 5 weeks to go before Otto, before there's even really a serious question here. Okay, so that's a quick blast down through some of the issues that cross your mind as you go down from, say, 4.5 to 19 weeks gestation. Obviously, the question that's been on the table, when does consciousness, awareness, experience emerge? I'm going to use those terms synonymously, and I'm not going to define them. And it's not just a question about infants, it's a question about bees, a range of issues, a range of non-human animals, organoids, assembloids, xenobots, all the synthetic biology that's coming down the pipe, and AI. We're going to need ways of addressing these questions if we can, or we just throw up our hands and say we don't know. I mean, that's the null hypothesis. I think in the field, if you step back, and the way the field's been structured is in terms of two approaches, a theory-based approach and a marker-based approach. And what I want to do in the rest of the talk, I want to spend a few minutes rehearsing some relatively familiar challenges for the theory-based approach. And then I'm going to spend a bit more time focusing on the marker-based approach, which I think has sort of gained ground. It's perhaps the dominant approach right now, and just really talk about some real challenges, I think, that force us back in the direction of theory. Okay, so a theory-based approach. What are you trying to do most abstractly if you're taking a theory-based approach to infant consciousness? Well, you take your favorite theory of consciousness, the one that you think is most plausible. You try and derive some necessary and sufficient conditions from it. You interrogate the data, whether it's behavioral or neurophysiological or metabolic, whatever it is. And then you try and use those necessary and sufficient conditions to develop thresholds, points beyond which you think consciousness doesn't emerge, points at which you think it has emerged. Now, there's two problems. They're both have been discussed. One's obvious, one's a little bit less obvious. I'm just going to go through both of them pretty quickly. The first is there are lots of theories of consciousness. So this is a table from a recent review that Anil, Seth, and I put together. It's not totally comprehensive. There's some theories actually I quite like that we left out, unfortunately. It's not just that there are lots of theories. People disagree, as you all know. So this is back to the ASSC data that I shared before. Here's what attendees at two of those, I don't know if you can read that, but you know, you can see that people's credences in the theories are fairly widely distributed. The one that comes out at top, predictive processing theory, is, to my mind, not a theory of consciousness at all, so that's a bit odd. But Ghislaine said you'll be happy to know global workspace is at the top. Higher order thought theories, David, you'll be glad to know that's number 2 or 3, depending if you put PPT in the list. And so it goes, right? Sensory motor theory is in the mix. Lots of theories are in the mix. So this is what, we know this. There's lots of debate. So that's a problem. And it's a problem because different theories look like they generate different predictions about infant consciousness. So then one of the first discussions in the recent consciousness literature, in the recent revival, Peter Carruthers appeals to a version of Hott to argue that consciousness doesn't emerge before the age of 3. Peters doesn't believe Hott anymore. He's got a different approach to consciousness, a version of global workspace theory. So this is no longer his view, but there are people who have gone into print in the last year saying that consciousness doesn't exist before the age of 3. He's not alone. Back also in 2003, Perner and Dinesh also appealed to a different treatment of Hott to argue that you don't really get infant consciousness before 1. Ghislaine, in her review paper, was looking at drawing on global workspace theory to suggest, I think, about 6 months of age, maybe 5 months of age. Yesterday was the point where you were suggesting evidence is there. And Jonathan Birch, in his recent book, it doesn't say that consciousness is present from 12 weeks gestation, but he says he makes the claim that the fetus is a sentience candidate. So there's credible scientific evidence for consciousness from 12 weeks gestation. That's a range. I mean, it's making an obvious point here, self-evident, but I think it's worth just reminding ourselves what a wide range of views the theory-based approach gives you. And a disagreement wouldn't be problematic if they converged on thresholds, but they don't. So on most of those views, Otto's not conscious at 19 weeks gestation. But on the Merker interpretation, on Birch's interpretation of Merker, he's been conscious for, 7 weeks? Or could have been conscious for 7 weeks. On some of those views, Ola, celebrating here her 2nd birthday, and I don't know about you, but I can see some kind of mix of trepidation, excitement, self-awareness. She's happy it's her birthday. She's a little bit afraid of she's a little, I don't know if I'm enjoying this. She's on the verge of tears, but I mean, I can see a lot of emotion in that face, but she's not conscious for another year if you put the threshold, put the threshold at 3. So, second problem, which is less discussed than the first. The first is obviously very familiar, but the second, I think, is sort of, in a way, more interesting. Theories of consciousness are almost entirely derived from adult data, and it's hard to say how to apply them to the non-human population. I'm not talking about validation or justification. That's obviously an issue. That's everyone's problem. But I'm talking about specification of the theory. Different theories have this problem in different ways and to different degrees, I think. And apologies to the advocates of global workspace theory, but I think it's easiest to explain the problem with reference to GWT. So here are the 2 figures that people wheel out in talking about GWT. There's the anatomical one of, as it were, the neural implementation in the adult human, and then there's this more abstract functional specification of GWT. And here's the question. If you want to know whether a bee or an AI system or a fetus has a global workspace, you obviously got to know about the system, but you got to know what the parameters of a global workspace are to know how to apply the theory to that system. You got to know what qualifies as a global workspace. So let's just take the bee, for example. Could the bee have a global workspace? Right? Well, some people have looked at this and said, well, that's what the global workspace requires a cortex. Bees don't have a cortex. One sentence, bees can't have a global workspace. I've seen that in print by prominent bee researchers. But that seems a little bit too quick to me. And Stan himself, when he's talking about non-human consciousness, has said, well, maybe fish could have a global workspace. Maybe you don't need this, you need something that implements more like that. Okay, I think that's kind of plausible. And if you're talking about global workspaces and AIs, you don't want to fixate on the human brain. You want to abstract away and talk about functional features. That seems appropriate. But then what are the dimensions, what are the parameters of that you're allowed to modulate and in how far, what directions, right? Even in the infant, there are going to be questions about when a consciousness supporting workspace emerges. It's not going to emerge de novo all at once, like Athena fully formed from the head of Zeus. It's going to come into being bit by bit in different ways. Ignition's going to splutter, presumably. There's going to be something that's global workspace-ish. And there's going to be judgment calls about when you've got something that's a genuine global workspace. Now, some people at this point are going to get itchy in their seats, understand that, and say, it's just words, it's just semantics. Why do we need the philosophers? Well, it is words. But it's not just words, because we're in an area where words matter. I mean, that's the whole thing, that there's a political background. We know about that. Words matter. So I think there are questions here about how to precisify, for example, the global workspace, and I'm just using that as an example, in a principled manner, rather than you can stipulate, sure, but that's cheating. That's theft over toil. Okay. So there are two challenges facing the theory. There's a lack of consensus and there's uncertainty about how to apply in a disciplined, empirically validated manner theory beyond the adult case. But I don't think we should just reject theory. I don't want to be against it. I think some really interesting things can happen when we take a theoretical approach. I'm just going to take 5 minutes out of the talk, then going to move on to markers, to make this point with respect to Jonathan Birch's book, because I think it's a great book, and it's been influential already. It's going to be influential. There's a lot of great stuff in it, but I have reservations about the treatment of infant consciousness, so I just want to make sure I've got the time to talk about this. What does Jonathan say? He says, I like the 12-week proposal. The fetus should be considered a sentience candidate. He's not claiming balance of probabilities is that it's conscious. It's a sentience candidate. It's a technical term for him. That's an important point from 12 weeks gestation. Description that flows from a credible evidence-based theoretical perspective. Okay, why does he think it's a sentience candidate from 12 weeks? There's two lines of argument, as far as I can tell, in the relevant chapter. The first, I wasn't going to talk about, but William's lovely talk yesterday, raising the issue of abortion, prompted me to mention some stuff. So partly he bases it on this paper, quite influential paper by Derbyshire and Brockman, Reconsidering Fetal Pain, where they say you don't need the cortex for pain. You can have pain experience before 24 weeks before the thalamical-cortical connections are there. I'm not going to talk about that paper other than to say, if you're interested in that issue, interested in that claim, you need to read this paper by Solomons and Gian Domenico Ionetti. Because, for one thing, Derbyshire and Brockman cite their work, and in the view of Solomons and Ionetti, misuse it, misappropriate, confuse sensitivity and specificity. So I'm not going to take any more time, but I think that's an important debate, and that's an important paper to look at. What I do want to focus on is Jonathan's use of Merker's framework, which I think is really interesting. I like Merker's approach to consciousness, his old approach. He's got a new view now, which I don't like, but people keep changing their views. But his old view, what is it? It's a midbrain focused account. Doesn't deny that the cortex contributes contents to consciousness, but the action, as it were, is in the midbrain. Subserves consciousness, generates consciousness by producing an integrated representation of the animal and its environment. This representation binds interoceptive and exteroceptive signals that the animal can then use to meet its homeostatic needs, its metabolic needs. All right, guides behavior. So it integrates information about your body, about perception, solves reafference problems, tells you where you are and helps you figure out what to do next. And Jonathan says, as soon as one grants the credibility of that picture, you need to take seriously the idea that the fetus may be sentient as soon as the relevant midbrain structures are in place, the superior colliculus, the periaqueductal gray, because they're functional at about 12 weeks. My question is, well, what does it mean for these structures to be functional? And I think if you're working within Merker's view, which he is at this point, you got to look to see what Merker says about functionality. And here's Birch himself applying Merker's view to the question of animals. What Merker requires, this is, as it were, what he means by functional, is evidence of a core behavioral control unit that constructs an integrated model of the animal in its environment, the whole animal in its environment, enabling flexible control of whole animal behavior in the service of biological needs. That's what would it be for those systems to be functional in the relevant sense. We're working with the Merker's framework. Now, people, Zandy Barron and Colin Klein, have said, we like Merker's account of human consciousness. We're going to apply it to insects. Looks like you've got homologous midbrain structures in the insect brain, the bee brain. We think bees are conscious. That's perfectly right. I mean, you could take issue with Merker's account, but I think it's appropriate. I think Merker's account does deliver a very plausible story about bee consciousness because it's observing whole brain, whole animal behavioral control that meets the needs. But I'm not sure about the fetus. I don't think the fetus has an integrated model of itself in its environment. We saw some really interesting data yesterday about representations of the mouth, of the hand, but I don't think it's got a representation of here's me, here's my environment, here's how I'm moving as a motile animal through that environment. The environment's massively constrained for the fetus. Even if you say it does, I don't think it's got a representation in the service of biological needs. It doesn't have, in the relevant sense, biological needs. That's what the placenta is doing for it, I think. Those needs are, as it were, already catered for. It's only when you're born that you have biological needs that you as a whole animal need to do anything about. So the upshot for me is kind of interesting, that a view of consciousness, a theoretical perspective, that's, I think, pretty liberal when it comes to animal consciousness. On Merker's account, animal consciousness is very widely distributed and relatively liberal when it comes to the possibility of AI consciousness, I think, is actually relatively conservative when it comes to fetal consciousness, provides little support for fetal consciousness, I would say, against Jonathan. Okay, so how am I doing for time? You gave me about a 10-minute introduction, by the way. Okay, what I want to do is blast from theory to markers. And I'm going to start here, possibly even this room. I wasn't present, so I don't know where the discussion was. I'm going to start in the other room. I'm going to start in the other room with the New York Declaration of Animal Consciousness, familiar to many of you, I imagine. Interesting, strong scientific support for mammals and birds. Mammals and birds are endotherms, not ectotherms. It's kind of interesting. And a realistic possibility of conscious experience and a whole bunch of other things, including insects. There's another page, so that's on one page of the website. There's another page of the website, which took me quite a while to find, but it's there, providing a summary of some of the evidence. And this is what you get on that other page, markers, which makes sense because you couldn't really, in that kind of a document, appeal to theory because no one's going to agree on the theory. So markers give you a more neutral starting point, or at least appear to give you a more neutral starting point. I'm not going to read these through. You've probably read most of them by now. I'm going to focus on two. Bees show apparent play behavior. I know someone else who shows apparent play behavior. Babies. I haven't ever seen anyone say because you play at, I don't know, when does play begin? Developmentalists? 2 months? 3 months? Depends what you mean. There's a very interesting, there's a very interesting poster, Jessica Babcock. I don't know, are you here? Suggests to play, that the fetus would play with the umbilical cord, play-like behavior. I don't know when play begins, but it's interesting to raise the issue of play in this context. Fruit flies have active and quiet sleep. I don't know. It's not I didn't use the word. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what play is in this context. I think that's the question. I'm just All I'm doing is drawing attention to some interesting connections between these markers and the fetal baby markers. I don't know when active and quiet sleep start to emerge. I think it's a bit fuzzy, but it's very early. In fact, there's a debate whether, well, I'll leave that to one second. Okay, so those are some markers that have been used in the animal context literature. Let's just, before we dig down into the infant stuff, think about what we mean by a marker. Or here's what I mean. Talk about positive markers. It's a feature whose presence is specific or thought to be specific to the presence of consciousness. One-way markers are going to have high specificity. So if the marker is there, you know it's very unlikely that consciousness is absent, but low or unknown sensitivity. You can have two-way markers, both highly specific and highly sensitive. So if you've got a two-way marker, which would be a beautiful thing to have, the marker provides evidence of consciousness. You don't need to think it's demonstrative. It's almost certainly not going to be demonstrative. It's evidence. It's an indicator. It's a marker. I don't like the word signature, which is used here because that suggests it's 100%. But indicator is perhaps a little bit more useful. And the absence of the marker provides evidence of the absence of consciousness. And the key question here, the one that everyone's struggling with, is how do you validate markers? How are these markers validated? It's a good question. I think there's different stories you might want to try to tell about different markers here. I'm not going to focus on that. The standard approach, I think, the one that I've had in the back of my mind, goes something like this. You've got a benchmarking step, and Niccolo talked about something like this yesterday in his talk. You use a contrastive method, and there's different kinds of contrasts because you can contrast different states. In adult humans, that's your benchmarking population, your source population. You get a fix on the sensitivity and or the specificity in adults. And then there's a generalizing or projecting step where you go from your benchmarking population to your target population, infants, bees, spots, what have you. So, for example, we talked a lot about this marker yesterday. There's the local global effect, where you've got sets of tones, beep, 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 beep. And then the crucial one is this one down here, where you've got no local oddball, but it's a global oddball because the regularity that you expect, the regularity that's been set up in the first sets, is no longer there. And the claim is that it seems to be reasonably specific in adults. You often find it in alert awareness, not always, but often, but you don't find it or rarely find it in deep sleep anesthesia or the vegetative state / unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. That's asterisked because there is a study showing that you can find it in about 15% of ES, UWS patients. But that's okay because we already know on other grounds that about 15% of those patients aren't really unconscious. So you kind of expect to find it in about 15% of patients. Labels get really tricky here. It is controversial, and I haven't kept up with all the literature, and I imagine here that people know more about this than I do, but my sense is that most of the criticisms focuses on its sensitivity rather than its specificity. And if you're treating it as a one-way marker, it's the specificity that you care about and not the sensitivity. Okay, so the marker-based approach, we've just seen that it's been applied to the animal literature. It's also been applied to the infant. The first explicit work in this vein is Sid's work. I'm sure earlier work had something like this in the back of its mind. But what I did with Joel and Lorena and some others in a recent paper that Dave mentioned is we looked at clusters of markers, and Claudia's done the same thing at about the same time. And I think that's the kind of the methodologically slightly new move here is you don't try and look at one marker in isolation, but you try and figure out what's convergent evidence, isn't it? You're trying to look at clusters and together. So Lorena talked a lot about the first of these markers, the functional connectivity networks. The other marker we looked at was not just sort of bottom-up, blindsidey kind of attention that you can get in blindsight, but top-down attention that looks like it involves frontal networks. That's drawing on some of the work that Nick Turp-Brown's done. Looks like multisensory integration of some kinds. The kinds that you see in the McGurk effect requires consciousness from adults. You can get other kinds of multisensory integration unconsciously, but our as far as we could tell from the literature, and maybe we're wrong, is that McGurk-like effects require consciousness, and then there's the local global effect and related second-order oddball paradigms that we look like. And obviously, they don't line up perfectly, and that's sort of interesting, but there seemed to be a rough convergence earlier than other people have suggested consciousness arises. So that's the claim we arrived at was consciousness is relatively early. Now, I don't know how much time I have, but I do want to get through some objections to the marker approach. And here are 4, I think. I can get through. Okay, let's go quickly. Maybe 6. I'll take 7. So one objection is you get out of it what you put into it, really. It's a bit like the theory-based approach. Depends what clusters, what markers you start with. And this is an objection that Henry Taylor and Andrew Bremner made in a letter that they published in Text. It just depends on which markers you take to be indicative of consciousness. And they said, look, take some other markers. In fact, the ones that Perner and Dinesh discussed way back in 2003, intentional means and coordination of action, explicit memory. If you look at these markers, they emerge at about 1 year. You get so why, we like the marker-based approach, they said, but, it doesn't deliver a univocal result, doesn't point you in a single direction. It's as bad as a theory-based approach. I don't think this quite works. The problem is, if you're treating your markers as one-way markers rather than two-way markers, then late markers don't undercut their early markers. So yeah, okay. Intentional means and action emerges late. But the absence of it doesn't indicate the absence of consciousness. So to make the challenge work, I think you have to treat these markers as two-way markers. You have to say their absence is indicative of the absence of consciousness. But that's, I think, pretty implausible in these cases when you're looking at these particular markers. Okay. Second objection. The marker approach treats the marker as sacrosanct. And what I mean by that is, well, critic could come along and say, you think you found evidence of consciousness in babies at age X, whatever, 3 months, because they satisfy your marker, right? They show the positive result on the local global test. But you didn't think the baby was conscious, so why not take the result to undermine the marker? Why not use that as evidence that your marker actually isn't really a good marker? It's a modus tollens move instead of the modus ponens for the philosophers in the room. So the advocate of the marker-based approach says target is M is a marker of consciousness, therefore the target is conscious. Well, critic says, well, why don't, I agree you can find the local global at, in neonates, but you didn't think the neonate was conscious. That's why you need the marker approach. So why not just conclude that the marker isn't really a marker of consciousness, at least in your population? I think the appropriate response to this challenge differs depending on whether you're talking about babies, bees, or bots in a way. And this is where I get stuck. I want to say with the bees and the babies, it's important to start with a recognition that it's not that we don't think they're conscious. They're not like rocks. Well, they're not like rocks actually are, rather than the 2% of people who thought the rocks were conscious, right? We're not certain that they're not conscious. They're open cases, they're candidate cases. We're unsure about the presence. So, we want to downgrade our faith in the marker and simultaneously, and this is sort of the weird thing when you think about it, but I think it's got to be right, upgrade our credence in the thinking that the target is conscious. But that means that the priors matter. So the kind of survey data that I started, some people say, that's what people think. Who cares what people think? Let's do the science. But once you're in the marker realm, you're adjusting your credences so your priors matter. That's a really important lesson here, I think. What about Claude? You give your local AI system the local global. I'm not going to think anything. Of course, they're going to pass the local global. It's not an interesting result. Why is it not interesting? I don't quite know what to say here. Is it because the system really just isn't a candidate for consciousness? We've got some assumption about the kinds of things that are plausible candidates for consciousness, and certain AI systems just don't meet that threshold. They're not embodied, for example. Is it that we're intuitively treating the local global test as a proxy for something else, working memory plus, and we don't think, or we think we know that the system doesn't have that something else, that it doesn't have working memory plus? Or is it because, well, it actually does give you a little bit of evidence, the fact that Claude might pass the local global, but we've got all this massive defeaters, and so that swamps any intuition that we've got a little bit of reason to think Claude's conscious. There's different stories to tell here. I'm not sure exactly what the most plausible one is, but I think there's interesting things to think about here. How many minutes do I have?
I'm being generous too.
I'm going to skip this one, Dan, and I'm going to finish with the last objection, because it's really the hardest one. The market-based approach needs encounter projectability, really. So there's two ways of thinking about this. We start the benchmarking population are adult humans, not always neurotypical, but they've got to be able to convince us that they're conscious or unconscious. So we need at least enough of our pre-theoretical markers in place to know that. And then the anthropocentric worry is, well, how do we project to, non-human mammals, reptiles, bees, and bots? Those are very different systems. What makes you think that a marker in us is a marker in something else? But we're not talking, at least primarily in this talk, about those kind of populations. And you might say, well, yeah, but we're talking about infants. So we don't really have to worry about that kind of problem because we're talking about conspecifics. Now that's too quick, I think. And Anna's point yesterday, I think, is a good one. We do need to worry about being adult-centric. Just because we're talking about conspecifics, certain kinds of worries don't arise, but other kinds of worries do arise. Right? We know that the relationship between the brain, the consciousness, and behavior changes over time. I think that the work on the attentional blink, the fact that it's so much longer as you get younger, is really a beautiful illustration of that. And something that we haven't really talked much about thus far is we know that consciousness itself changes. So it's not just, as it were, the functional package within which consciousness is constrained, but the thing that we're trying to get at is also likely to change as well. And to make that point, I think we need to think about the structure of consciousness. So here's how I approach it. There's the generic property that we're interested in. When does consciousness emerge? But that's modulated in two different ways, at the level of global states and at the level of contents. The global states, for example, there's wakefulness, there's dreaming, there's the psychedelic state. There's a whole bunch of different ways that consciousness is modulated at a global level. And of course, there's different kinds of contents. And we know, or at least it's pretty plausible to think that the global states of consciousness in early infancy are a little bit different. They're going to be continuous, but they're going to be a little bit different to those of the adult. And we know that the contents are probably going to be different. This is one of the things that was raised yesterday by Susan, Joel's talk. Right? What are the contents? How is the infant passing the world? There's perceptual narrowing. The contents, it's not just that infants start with a few contents and get richer contents. They in some ways start with rich contents and lose those contents as well. So it goes both ways. So we know that this thing where we've got our benchmarking population here, the thing that we're trying to project onto is not just encased in a sort of a functional, behavioral, cognitive system that's different and differently related to consciousness, but the package itself has got different features. So it's a tough problem. I don't know how to solve it, and I shouldn't have left it for the last 30 seconds of my talk. But I just want to throw kind of one set of ideas as a sort of a starting point, or at least one way to think about how the problem is maybe not quite so tough as it first appears, which is that even within adult consciousness, there's a lot of variation. Right? Global states are not monolithic, and this is one of the things that consciousness science has discovered in the last 10 years, or discovered anew. Meditation, psychedelics, ego dissolution, mild sedation. There's a whole lot of variety within adult experience. And there's a lot of different contents, and you can probe that space to try and get a sense of what features are more contingent and what features are more essential. that probing might in turn guide decisions about when it's legitimate to apply adult markers, how far you can apply them along what dimensions to infants. And the other thing is obvious point, but I think it's just worth reminding ourselves, we don't just have adults and babies. We've got a developmental trajectory. We've got 4-year-olds who are clearly conscious. And again, I think Sid's work on the attentional blink is just beautiful because it doesn't just go from, the baby to the adult. There's a transition, there's a trajectory. And that gives you a starting point to think about how to project which dimensions are going to be continuous down to development and which dimensions are going to change, and when you're allowed to project and when you're going to get yourselves into trouble taking adult markers and applying them to the infant. So I've gone on for too long. Oh, final point. Here's what you'd love to do. You develop a new marker based on your hypothesis of infant consciousness, and then you go back to your benchmarking population and say, okay, let's try and see if that works at the adult level. I mean, that would be the holy grail. Okay, are we back to a theory first approach? Yeah, kind of in some form, but really it's a theory that's bottom up, empirically grounded, looking at the rich distribution of rich diversity of human experience, which is what theories have always tried to do, but they haven't always done it, I think. And it's worth, I think, being explicit about what we should be doing. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this question, but do you have a sense of when people make these judgments in the surveys, a rock's conscious, a fish conscious, where those judgments are coming from? Are they coming from markers, or are they coming from just looking into the eyes as you did with your daughter and seeing a sentient being there? That would kind of make a difference to the epistemic weight, I suppose, we should put on these judgments.
Yeah, that's a great question. In both surveys, the Phil papers is primarily philosophers. The ASSC data is 2/3 scientists, 1/3 philosophers. My guess is, especially with the baby stuff, people are looking into the eyes. It's what we do. Yeah. So that's what's driving it. So as a human being, as someone with folk psychology who's wired to take the phenomenal stance in various things, you look at these facial responses, you look at behavioral contingencies, you look into the eyes, and absolutely harder with a bee or an amoeba or a worm. And you can remind yourself of the data, and some of the ASSC people would have had their responses would have been infused by theoretical commitment. How much? My guess is not a whole lot. But I think that was really interesting. I was going to present, there's data on ordinary folks' attributions to LLMs. And that's really interesting because that, there's no eyes to look into. And I was astonished to discover that at least the one study I know of suggests that 40% of people who use them think that there's some degree of consciousness.
Some possibility of
some possibility of
very different thing.
Yeah, okay. So the headline. Okay, they report their they misreported their LLMs. Yeah. Okay, they misreport their own data, do they?
At some point, they've now switched to reporting it as
some possibility. Okay,
people are asking, what possibility do you think there is that language models are conscious? If you say 0, then they report you as saying no possibility. So, 1 on a scale from 0 to 100.
So you're a better person than I am because you looked at the data. I just looked at the headline.
So thank you, fantastic talk. So first, I have 2 points, if I can make. One is regarding Birch's approach. I also thought that there was a problem in the way that he uses Merker's view to justify that fetus are sentence candidates at 12 weeks. But I had a different point as you. I think Merkel's view actually opened the possibility that fetus might be sentence candidates at 12 weeks of gestation. Once you get rid of the thalamus cortical structure as necessary for consciousness, and you have some sort of flexible behavior that can indicate pain behavior, I think he has a good point that maybe fetus will might be conscious before the 24, 26 weeks that mark the emergence of the thalamocortical structure. So maybe you think at 12 weeks we don't have like a good behavior indication, but it opens the door that at certain point this might emerges. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on what exactly the behavioral repertoire of a fetus might be before 24 weeks. I mean, there's some nice posters, people looking at that. I guess I just have the background suspicion that it's going to be relatively localized. It's moving, you know, exploring your face. And it's got a reference to twins exploring each other's faces. But what Merck is interested in is solving the reafferent, you know, where am I moving or is the world moving?
Mm-hmm.
That's what you need, an integrated whole body, because you can't guide action unless you know whether I'm moving or whether the world's moving, right? To track objects, to know how to behave, to know how to pursue your metabolic needs. And that requires sort of an integrated representation of where I am in space. You need something like a subject-object distinction. And I don't, at the level of the whole animal, I think that's what Merck really needs. And surely you can have a kind of hand-based you can have local limb-centric representations that might guide very simple movements without having anything like that. So that's one bit, but it's actually, I think in a way, it's to guide bodily needs. I don't think there's a kind of evolutionary thought in the back of my mind here. Why would I don't think we've got any evidence that there's a representation that's doing that. And I don't think there's any need really for that representation. You might argue that you want to build something like that up in the womb so that it's up and running when you're born. But the environment's going to be very different, and your bodily affordances are going to be very different once you're born. So, I think the jury's out, but I'm skeptical, I guess. Yeah. So, just I wanted to have a question. Yeah, it's a finger. I think.
Because for pain, I am lost, because we know that to assess the depth of comatose patient, you pinch them to see how they react to pain, but they are in coma. So it's not a proof that you react to pain that you are conscious. So, or I misunderstood something.
Yeah.
Because I mean, comatose adults, you pinch them to see how deep is their coma. So they are comatose. They are unconscious, and they react to pain.
Yeah, I wasn't wanting to engage with the issue about pain. I just wanted to put that reference to the very important paper, I thought, because it came up yesterday. Yeah. Well, I can talk about the Divisher and Brockman paper. I mean, they cite some case studies of people that, the case study where they say that the cortical parts of the pain matrix are not there. So-called pain matrix are not there, but the person was still in pain. So they argue that you don't actually need cortical activation for pain. So there's at least a possibility of pain in the absence of the cortex. But they're using pain by definition. They're distinguishing pain from nociception. So nociception doesn't need to be conscious. Yeah. Sorry.
Just commenting on this, the Merker evidence is very, as I recall, I have read that paper a very long time ago, is very dominated by your intuitions about these hydrocephalic kids. And their reactions may be like the ones that Ghislaine is talking about, where they just don't go through anything that you'd call a conscious state. They're, mediated by some, midbrain thing that skips consciousness. So I'd be very wary about relying on intuitions like that.
Yeah, that's part of the paper. There's a whole, I think that's section 5 or section 6. There's a whole earlier bit digging down pretty deep into the neurobiology, looking at just how interconnected the midbrain systems are to action control systems, how much integrative work they do. And I think he's also resting, and it's obviously problematic, but we all do some of this to some degree, on just the intuition that if consciousness were, there's a sort of an appeal to what the function of consciousness might be and how it would be useful for consciousness, right? We do need to solve a reference problem in the way that plants don't. We're moving, a creature that moves through its environment needs to know when it's moving, when the world's moving. And you've got to integrate that information with information about when you're hungry, when you're thirsty, all the homeostatic information. And so you got to put all that stuff together, and then you bring in the neurobiology that the midbrain is doing a whole lot of that. Yes, of course, you could get cortical contribution to the contents of consciousness. But yeah, I take the point, it's controversial. His take on blindsight is controversial. Superior collicular stuff is.
Well, that actually leads into the point I wanted to make, which is that one problem with relying on intuitions, quite generally, is we do not usually intuitively separate consciousness from attention. But we have very good reason to think that these are distinct capacities that are, causally interact, of course.
Yeah.
But if once you start thinking, we've got to make this distinction, we've got to be very careful about this distinction.
Yeah.
Then if we look at things like what you were suggesting, the varieties of consciousness in people, those may be primarily varieties of attention in people. So, I guess my general point is you just have to keep these intuitions at arm's length, because there are all kinds of factors that we know are relevant.
Yeah.
But
Can I? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, maybe this is a not a fair move, but can I play block against block? I guess I think the background theory is a bit like the theory that you appealed to in your mesh paper, where you've got a bunch of markers, and you're looking, can you pull A apart from P? You're trying to treat it as something like a natural kind, and you're trying to converge on something that's going to give you the best explanatory predictive value. Yes, you don't quite know how attention and consciousness are related, and Bob's here and he's done beautiful work showing that they can dissociate. But to think they're not related at all, that's crazy, right? So, I actually wanted to appeal to bottom-up attention, because I think even with Bob's beautiful work on showing that you can get attention in blind, I still think it's a marker. It seems unlikely that all kids are going to be born with blind sight, as it were. Maybe so, but that, we're in the probability raising game. But co-authors probably rightly convinced me out of it. So we were appealing to sort of Nick's work and other people's work on front attention that recruits frontal areas, that's more endogenously driven, goal driven, it's cognitive. So it's maybe not phenomenal consciousness, but seems more broadly to be regarded as a marker of consciousness. So yeah, I take the point, but.
Okay, if we have quick questions and quick answers, we can get a few more in. Andrew.
So I had a question actually directly on something you just said. So I was thinking that if you think of consciousness more as a natural kind, then the markers approach is going to be really attractive, because then you're just trying to find a bunch of properties that cluster together. And then some of the objections you had to the markers approach don't really make that much sense, like holding a marker as sacrosanct or something like that, because some of the properties of the natural kind aren't always going to be instantiated by the kind or something like that. But if you think that consciousness is a theoretical kind, And the theory-based approach is going to be very attractive because basically then you're just stipulating what you think consciousness is and then trying to work in some explanatory task. So I was just curious as to what you thought about that.
So, I mean, I think theories of consciousness are generally, certainly the scientific, what's badged as scientific theories are in effect treating consciousness as a natural kind. It's just that they don't always sign up to that kind of methodology that might come along with that, right? They think it's a real thing, generally speaking. You can find papers that seem to suggest the other, but they think of it, it's a real structure in the environment that does causal explanatory work. And, its contours aren't defined into existence. They're discovered rather than stipulated. And so that's, I don't see it as an alternative, but maybe putting it in those terms is more, maybe that makes it explicit what people often sort of is more implicit in theoretical approaches and not always signed up to. Sorry, Laurie Paul, trying to be short.
So thanks for the talk. I'm struggling with how you think of the distinction between intelligence and consciousness. So, and this seems to be like at play with some of these debates. So I might say, look, C. elegans demonstrates a kind of intelligence because it remembers and learns and intentionally moves towards different temperature gradients. But I certainly don't think it's got consciousness. And then there was and then the question is, how do we interpret particular scientific work, like about bees playing or dancing? My worry is that, especially when reading this work, there's a notion of intelligence that's at play, not a kind of implication of consciousness. And so I don't understand the distinction that I think you're implicitly drawing. Can you say more about that?
So I'm not equating the two. I mean, for me, consciousness is what Tom Nagel and Dave Johnson, is there something it's like to be? That's not a useful distinction. That's not a useful, as it were, definition. We can give you examples and you can try and generalize beyond those examples. What's jazz? Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, John Coltrane. When Ornette Coleman came along, they said it wasn't jazz. He's now in the Jazz Hall of Fame. Is it jazz? Have you gone beyond so it's difficult, right? I can give you an example. Infant consciousness might be to your experience like Ornette Coleman is to Miles Davis or John Coltrane or Louis Armstrong. So, it's difficult. I don't want to equate intelligence. But what I was doing with the placing is that in this room about a year ago, people said, well, here's evidence that non-human animals are conscious, bees play.
Okay, Tobin. Very quick question, probably yes, no. You talk about the adult-centric world, and I haven't read Roger's book, but in the animal world, they're all adult animals. So people looked at immature developing animals. Is a tadpole conscious? Is a kitten conscious? Is a larva, a bee larva? And is there any benefit of looking at the developmental stages of consciousness in non-human animals?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, we were having a wonderful discussion at dinner last night. My photo of Otto at 4.5 months, he couldn't even roll over. William was talking to me about watching a horse being born. After an hour, it's gambling away. Right, the myelination is there, ready to go. Myelination doesn't really start and takes months. So, absolutely, when we're talking about, as it were, fetal consciousness, we're implicitly restricting ourselves to human beings. And maybe we don't have fetal consciousness in humans, but maybe you do have it in the sheep or the horse or animals where the developmental trajectory is very different. So I think a comparative approach is right, but I'll be quiet.
Okay, last question, Sophie Nelson.
So this is regarding the issue of how the marker method fails to give a univocal verdict. So, you were talking about how if infants and animals pass the local global test, we might be inclined to attribute consciousness. But then if, ChatGPT passes the local global test, that's not going to convince us. Right. And one explanation that I was thinking is maybe we, most of us are intuitively inclined to think the most plausible version of the marker method will be sort of pluralistic in a sense, that in some cases we'll need different markers or more markers than we do in other cases. Because I mean, it seems like there are kind of a lot of cases across the board where this is true. So like, for example, suppose my cat randomly started talking, that would be, or producing language, that to me would be a pretty clear indicator of consciousness in my cat. I don't think anybody could convince me that my cat wasn't conscious if it started doing that. But then, you know, language clearly isn't a marker of consciousness in LLMs. And then, you know, so that's a case where we would need, you know, different markers for different systems. And then there also might be cases in which we would need more markers in some systems than others. So like a rock would have to do a lot more and show a lot more signs of consciousness to convince me that it's conscious than a fetus would.
Yeah, I mean, so if you start with the adult human and you try and extrapolate your markers from us in an iterative, you know, you use your starting set of markers, you develop a kind of proto-theory, you use that to get markers that might then generalize beyond us to other species, to AI. Yeah, maybe, I mean, who knows how far this process can go, but it strikes me the further away you get from us along, it's not clear which dimensions, but along the dimensions that seem to matter, the more you're going to need theory to guide your development of markers, because you can't, as it were, validate them in us. Infants are an interesting case because they're close to us in many ways, but then there's certain respects in which there's these questions about projectability and generalizability still arise here, and they can't be unproblematically extended, I think.
Okay, many thanks.